Have you ever felt that haunting contradiction? The closer you got to them, the further away they seemed to drift. You could almost taste the intimacy, feel the safety building, and in that very moment, they pulled back. Cold, silent, almost unreachable. And you were left spiraling, asking yourself, what did I do wrong? But here's the truth you've never been told. It wasn't you. In fact, in those very moments, they wanted you most. And that's why they ran. It sounds insane, doesn't it? To push away what you're craving. But this is the hidden language of the avoidant heart. They don't leave because they don't care. They don't withdraw because your love isn't felt. They pull back because wanting you exposes something they've spent their entire lives protecting. Desire makes them vulnerable. Love makes them unsafe. Closeness reawakens the old wound that says, if I let someone all the way in, I will lose myself, or worse, I'll lose them. So when an avoidant feels that pull towards you, when they begin to notice that you are not just another face, but someone who could actually matter, it triggers panic in their nervous system. Your warmth, your devotion, your consistency, what you thought was building trust, suddenly feels like danger to them. They may ghost you, pick a fight, criticize you, or disappear into their silence, not because they want distance, but because they want too much. Their love comes tangled with fear, their desire is chained to their dread, and so the more they feel, the harder they push. And if you've been on the receiving end of that, you know the disorientation. You know the whiplash of being cherished one moment and abandoned the next. You replay every conversation, every look, every word, wondering if you said too much, gave too much, wanted too much. But let me ask you this. What if the push wasn't rejection? What if it was proof of how deeply they were being moved? What if their silence, their retreat, their distance was actually their body's way of saying, this matters too much. I don't know if I can survive it. This is where the story begins. Not in your supposed failures, but in their buried fear. And once you understand that, everything about the dynamic starts to change. Closeness is supposed to feel safe, isn't it? That's what we're told. That when you find someone who sees you, who accepts you, who stays, your nervous system should settle. You should exhale. But for the avoidant, closeness is not soothing. It's suffocating. And it's not because they don't value connection. It's because somewhere deep in their earliest blueprint for love, closeness was wired to pain. Imagine this. A child reaching out for comfort, and instead of being met with warmth, they're met with absence, or worse, with criticism. Imagine learning that your needs overwhelm the very people you depend on to survive. Imagine discovering, long before your mind could even form words, that if you cry too loudly, if you lean in too much, love withdraws. That's not a memory they carry consciously. It's a body memory. It lives in their nervous system. So now, as an adult, when someone like you comes along and offers closeness, genuine, safe, steady closeness, their body remembers the old danger. The body screams, run, protect yourself. Don't need too much. This is why your love feels like pressure to them. Not because you are too much, but because their system has never learned that it's safe to be held, safe to be known, safe to be dependent on another human being. So when they want you, when they feel the gravitational pull toward you, the threat isn't you. The threat is their own longing. Longing exposes their need, and need feels like danger. And here's where the heartbreaking paradox shows up. You think their silence means disinterest. You think their withdrawal means rejection. You interpret their distance as proof that you weren't enough. But the truth is, your presence matters more than you realize. That's why they feel the need to protect themselves from it. If you were insignificant, they wouldn't need to run. They wouldn't need to armor up. They wouldn't feel this overwhelming fear of being swallowed whole. So what does this mean for you, the one who keeps reaching out? It means you have to stop reading their retreat as proof of your inadequacy. It means you stop asking, what's wrong with me, and start asking, what is this stirring in them that they don't yet know how to handle? That shift alone reclaims your power. Because the moment you stop personalizing their pushback, you stop playing into the cycle of chasing, proving, overextending, those desperate attempts to fix a wound that was never yours to begin with. And let me ask you this, what if their push isn't the end of connection, but the beginning of it? What if that recoil is simply their nervous system screaming in old languages? And what if you could stop trying to fight against it and instead see it for what it is? Fear dressed up as distance. That changes everything, doesn't it? Because now, instead of scrambling to hold on tighter, you begin to understand that their reaction isn't about your worth. It's about their wiring. And that perspective doesn't just free you, it sets the stage for how you respond, for how you reclaim your own center when their fear collides with your love. Here's the twist. Most people never see avoidance, don't just fear love. They crave it with an intensity they rarely admit even to themselves. They want what you offer. They long for the intimacy, the laughter, the quiet moments where two people breathe in sync. They imagine it, sometimes obsess over it, and at times let themselves taste it. But the moment they realize how much they want it, the moment they feel how deep the need goes, their survival instincts kick in. Desire flips into danger. It's like standing in front of a feast after years of starving. The body wants to devour it all, but the mind whispers, if I take this in, it will destroy me. If I depend on this, I will lose control. I will lose myself. And so what do? They step back. They act like they're not hungry. They pretend the food doesn't matter, but inside, the craving burns hotter than ever. This is why you feel such a contradiction with them. One moment, they're leaning in, eyes soft, heart open, words spilling that sound like forever, and then suddenly they vanish. It makes no sense when you're on the receiving end. But inside them, it makes perfect sense. Because closeness feels like surrender, and surrender feels like annihilation. They believe, often unconsciously, that if they fully give themselves over to the connection, they will disappear. But here's the deeper truth. The avoidant is not pushing you away because you don't matter. They're pushing you away because you matter too much. Your presence awakens the hunger they've been taught to suppress. Your love pokes at the locked doors inside of them. Your closeness brings their need to the surface, and need is the very thing they swore to themselves they would never have. And if you've been through this, you know the exhaustion. You know what it's like to feel someone's warmth at midnight and their ice by morning. You know the ache of realizing that the very love you've poured out with open hands becomes the very thing that triggers their withdrawal. But what if you began to see that withdrawal differently? What if you could name it for what it is? Not rejection, not betrayal, not proof that you were unlovable, but simply fear. What if their pulling away wasn't about escaping you, but about escaping themselves? Because that is the secret. Avoidants aren't running from you. They're running from the parts of themselves they don't yet know how to face, their hunger, their longing, their aching need to be loved. They've built an identity on being self-sufficient, on needing no one. And so when you become the exception, when you awaken that forbidden hunger, it terrifies them. And here's the shift for you. Once you see this, you stop confusing their fear with your failure. You stop chasing the retreat as though your worth depends on catching it. You begin to stand in your knowing that their pullback is proof of their craving, not the absence of it. If this is landing for you, subscribe. We're just getting started. Have you noticed how the pushback doesn't usually come at the beginning? At the start, avoidance can feel almost magnetic. They'll chase you, charm you, initiate, pull you into their orbit. They feel safe in the pursuit because pursuit doesn't demand vulnerability. It's when you start responding, when the connection begins to deepen, when your presence becomes consistent, that the panic shows up. that's when they suddenly shift, as if overnight. And here's the cruel irony. The more real it gets, the more unsafe it feels. At the peak of intimacy, the moment they should relax into the trust being built, they feel the walls closing in. Why? Because intimacy requires surrender. Intimacy requires letting go of control. And for an avoidant, control has been their armor, their shield, their survival mechanism. To drop it feels like death. Picture this. You've just had a weekend together that felt magical. They laughed freely. They let their guard down. Maybe they even whispered words they usually withhold. You drive home glowing, thinking, finally, we're breaking through. And then the silence, the sudden coldness, the text that goes unanswered, the plans that are suddenly too much, and you're left questioning, was any of it real? Yes, it was real. In fact, that's the problem. It was too real. Their system interprets that peak of closeness as a cliff edge, and they'd rather retreat than risk the fall. The intensity of their desire collides with the terror of their dependency, and the safest way they know to regulate that panic is to push you away. It's not rational, it's survival. And let me ask you, how many times have you internalized that retreat as rejection? How many times did you sit in the silence thinking you must have ruined it, when in reality, the depth of the connection was the very thing that triggered their fear? This is where the cycle becomes so destructive, because you, in your longing, often respond by reaching harder, proving more, giving more. And to them, that only amplifies the suffocation. They feel chased when all you're trying to do is reassure. They feel pressure when all you're offering is devotion. But here's the radical reframe. Their retreat after intimacy is not a verdict on your value. It's an alarm going off in their body. They're not saying, I don't want you. They're saying, I don't know how to survive wanting you this much. When you begin to see it this way, you stop getting trapped in the endless dance of blame. You stop mistaking their fear for your flaw. And the tragedy is, by pushing away at the very peak of connection, avoidants sabotage the very love they're desperate for. They build walls around the very nourishment they crave. They starve themselves at the feast. And unless they face this pattern, they will keep destroying what they desire most. And here's where your power comes in. Because once you stop personalizing their pushback, you can learn how to respond differently. You can stand steady when their fear collides with your love, and in doing so, you stop letting their panic dictate your peace. One of the most confusing parts of loving an avoidant is the disguise they wear. Because instead of showing you their fear directly, they translate it into behaviors that look like rejection. They might criticize you, pick apart the tiniest details of how you love them, or suddenly withdraw into silence. Sometimes it's irritation over nothing, or a burst of anger that doesn't match the moment. To you, it feels personal. It feels like they've turned against you. But what if those reactions weren't about you at all? What if criticism and withdrawal are simply masks for the one thing they're terrified to admit, that they feel vulnerable? See, an avoidant has often learned that vulnerability equals danger. To admit fear, to admit need, to admit longing, that would mean handing someone the power to wound them. And so instead of confessing, I feel too close and it scares me, they push you away with irritation. Instead of saying, I need you more than I want to admit, they withdraw to create distance. Instead of showing you their trembling hands, they clench their fists. It's a tragic performance, but a convincing one. Because if they can make you believe you're the problem, if they can project their panic onto you, they don't have to face the truth of their own vulnerability. They keep their armor intact, even if it costs them the very intimacy they secretly crave. But here's where your power sharpens. You get to decide whether you'll take the bait. You get to decide whether you'll swallow their projection as truth, or whether you'll pause and say, wait, this anger isn't really about me. This withdrawal isn't proof of my unworthiness. This is fear in disguise. And let me ask you, how many times have you walked on eggshells, trying to manage their moods, soften their criticism, calm their storms, thinking that if you just handled it right, the love would return? How many times have you shrunk yourself to avoid triggering their withdrawal, when in reality their withdrawal was never about your actions, but about their fear of being seen? When you start seeing through the disguise, you stop shrinking, you stop explaining yourself to their fear, you stop treating their criticism as a verdict on your worth. And here's the paradox. When you no longer absorb their projections, you actually give them a chance if they're willing to face what's underneath. Because once the disguise stops working, once the blame doesn't land on you, they're left with the truth, their fear, their longing, their hunger. This is not easy work. It requires a steady heart. It requires remembering, in the heat of criticism or in the sting of silence, that what you're witnessing is fear, not fact. But this perspective changes everything. It frees you from the trap of reaction. It allows you to remain centered, even when they're unraveling. And it puts the responsibility back where it belongs, on them to face the vulnerability they've spent a lifetime avoiding. So the next time their distance feels like proof that you're unworthy, pause. Ask yourself, what if this is not rejection, but fear wearing another mask? That question alone has the power to shift the entire dynamic. Send this to someone who's been stuck in this dynamic for far too long. If the avoidance push was truly rejection, they'd stay gone, they'd disappear completely, never look back. But you've probably noticed something different. They circle back, they text after days of silence, they resurface after weeks of distance. Sometimes they even return after months as if nothing happened. And you're left in confusion, torn between the sting of their absence and the relief of their return. So why do they come back? The answer is as paradoxical as their push in the first place. Avoidants retreat when the intimacy feels overwhelming, but that doesn't erase their desire. The craving remains. The longing simmers under the surface. And once their nervous system calms, once the panic fades, the hunger rises again. They remember the warmth, the laughter, the safety you offered. They reach for it, not because they've worked through their fear, but because the need has become undeniable again. This is the cycle. Closeness, panic, retreat, longing, return, again and again. And unless something changes, you'll find yourself living inside this endless loop, mistaking every return for a breakthrough, only to be pushed away when the intimacy peaks again. And here's the most important truth. Their coming back is not proof of transformation, it's proof of desire. They want you. They just don't yet know how to handle wanting you. And if you confuse that desire for readiness, you'll hand over your heart again, only to watch them retreat. But what if, instead of collapsing into relief when they return, you use that moment to stand taller? What if, instead of rushing to reopen the door, you paused and asked yourself, what do I need? Not just what do they want, because their pattern is to regulate their fear by controlling the distance. But your power is to regulate your worth by controlling your standards. Let me ask you, how many times have you mistaken their return for a promise? How many times have you believed, this time it's different, only to feel the cold withdrawal again? And how many times did you shrink, soften, or silence your needs, just to keep them from retreating again? The shift happens when you realize that their return is not the moment to lose yourself. It's the moment to find yourself, to anchor in your clarity, to recognize that if they are truly going to stay, it won't be because you've been smaller, but because they finally learn how to expand bigger. And if they can't, then their cycle no longer gets to define your life. Yes, they will come back, but the real question is, will you still be waiting in the same place, or will you have risen into a version of yourself that no longer mistakes crumbs of connection for a feast? Their return doesn't have to be your surrender. It can be your mirror, a reminder of how far you've come and of the standard you now refuse to drop. The greatest trap of loving an avoidant is believing that your peace depends on their presence. That if only they stayed, if only they chose you fully, you could finally rest. But here's the breakthrough. The cycle doesn't end when they change. The cycle ends when you stop collapsing every time they push. When their retreat no longer pulls you out of yourself, you break free. Because the truth is, the push itself is not the problem. It's how you respond to it. If you rush into proving yourself, if you beg, chase, explain, or twist yourself into knots to keep them close, you reinforce their fear. You teach their nervous system that closeness is suffocating because your fear mirrors theirs. But when you stay steady, when you hold your center, something remarkable happens. The push loses its power. Imagine this. Instead of panicking when they withdraw, you breathe. Instead of asking, what did I do wrong? You ask what is mine to carry and what isn't. Instead of rushing to pull them back, you allow the distance while staying rooted in your worth. That shift alone changes the entire dynamic because suddenly their fear doesn't dictate your behavior. Their retreat doesn't collapse your identity. You stop being a participant in the cycle and start being the anchor outside of it. And here's the paradox. When you stop collapsing, you actually become safer to them. Your steadiness communicates what words can't. That love doesn't have to be a battlefield. That closeness doesn't have to mean control. You model the security they've never known, not by fixing them, but by refusing to abandon yourself in the process. But even more important than what it signals to them is what it builds in you. When you learn to stand unshaken in the face of their fear, you reclaim something priceless, your own freedom. You stop living at the mercy of someone else's wounds. You stop hinging your worth on the rise and fall of their presence, and you begin to live from a deeper truth that you are whole whether they stay or not. Let me ask you, what would it feel like to finally stand in that kind of power? To no longer be pulled into the storm every time they retreat. To know with quiet certainty that you don't have to beg, bend, or break to be chosen. That is the moment the cycle breaks, not when they change, but when you do. And from that place, everything shifts. Because then their push can no longer shake you. Their silence no longer defines you. Their fear no longer becomes your prison. You become free, not because they stopped running, but because you stopped chasing. And that freedom is what transforms the entire story. So here you are, standing at the edge of a truth most people never see. That when an avoidant pushes you away, it isn't proof of your inadequacy. It isn't the universe telling you that you're unlovable. It is fear masquerading as distance, panic disguised as indifference, longing wrapped in armor. And the paradox is almost poetic. They push hardest when they want most. But the bigger question is not about them. It's about you, because you've spent too long personalizing their retreat, too long confusing their fear with your flaw, too long twisting yourself into a smaller shape to hold together something that was never yours alone to carry. The deeper invitation here is not to decode every signal or to predict every withdrawal. It's to decide who you will be in the face of it. Will you keep shrinking? Or will you rise? Will you keep collapsing at the sound of silence? Or will you learn to anchor so deeply in your own worth that no push can unseat you? That is the threshold you stand on now, not waiting for them to change, but choosing the standard you will no longer drop. And maybe, just maybe, when you stop chasing, when you stop apologizing for the gravity of your love, when you finally stand steady in yourself, you'll discover the freedom you've been craving all along. A freedom that says, I am not defined by someone else's fear. I am not measured by the distance they create. I am whole, whether they stay or whether they run. And in that freedom, something shifts. You see them differently, you see yourself differently, and you stop being a character in the same old story. You become the author of a new one. A story where your worth isn't up for debate, where your love is not a bargaining chip, where your peace is no longer dependent on anyone else's presence or absence. So I'll leave you with this. The next time someone pulls away, at the very moment you feel the closeness growing, will you let it define you, or will you let it refine you? Because the way you answer that question changes everything. If this spoke to you, subscribe, not as a transaction, but as a promise to yourself that you're done shrinking for love and ready to rise into it instead.